And the title of his talk is Consciousness as the Mechanism, Consciousness as the Mechanism of Attention.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Bob. First, a confession. I am a virgin. I've never been to a Tucson Consciousness Conference, so it's a real pleasure to be here. Okay. I want to begin by saying a little bit about what attention is, because I think in debates about the contribution of attention to consciousness, we often get bogged down in spurious disagreements because people have simply defined their terms differently. And maybe by presenting my definition of attention, we'll see that there's more common ground between Bob's views and my own, which I think would be a happy outcome. Though I think there will also be some residual disagreements. So for me, attention is a process by which information and perception becomes available to working memory. So it's a kind of gatekeeper that allows information to propagate forward in the nervous system. And thinking about attention as something that changes, that modulates activity in a way that allows for information flow. We can capture the idea that attention can be both bottom-up and top-down. So a stimulus, as in the case of pop-out, can capture our attention, or in the case of visual search or other strategic processes, we can choose to attend to things. Both of these share a common denominator. Both with pop-out and visual search, information is becoming available to working memory. It's worth noting in passing that attention can also be focal or diffuse. A lot of information can be brought in a degraded way, perhaps, to a working memory at once, or sometimes a single object can be selected from a complex field. So attention can be varied in its scope. There's a lot of literature suggesting that attention and consciousness seem to correlate, and I'll begin by talking a little bit about correlation, and then we'll get deeper into the necessity and sufficiency question. So with respect to correlation, it's also useful to say a little bit further, a little bit more about what attention is at a cellular or population level. I have been skeptical for years about the idea that synchrony of the nervous system is related to consciousness, and I'm no longer skeptical. So there's a lot of work, though controversial, suggesting that a neural correlate of attention is synchrony, and perhaps even synchrony within the gamma band. So this is just a slide from Prinz showing that if you torture a monkey and get it to attend to different gradients, you can show that when it's attending to one, you'll see synchrony for the corresponding cell population in the visual stream. And I think this kind of change in attention, change in cellular response is modulated typically by structures in parietal cortex. They're not always. And we know a lot about what goes on even at a cellular level, at the level of ion channels, when this modulation takes place. We know, in other words, how gamma arises. We also know what happens when these changes take place. There can be changes in modulation, including an increase in coordination and synchrony, as well as spiking at the gamma band. I think this process, this gamma process, makes information available to working memory, but doesn't guarantee that it actually gets encoded in working memory. For that, other cellular processes are involved, and there's some evidence that theta band activity is associated with working memory encoding. But the basic circuit that says you use parietal control structures to modulate the perceptual centers so that they propagate information forward to lateral frontal cortex, a seat of working memory, I think is a very good candidate for the circuit of consciousness. And you see this again and again. So if you look at studies that contrast conditions of awareness as opposed to unawareness, you tend to see data that look like this. You see that when changes are detected in change blindness, parietal cortex, that's attention, and visual cortex, and lateral frontal cortex, that's working memory, all seem to arise. You see that in cases of masking, that same circuit, so it's attention, working memory, and perception. You see it in cases of detection in attentional blink, a phenomenon I'll come back to in a second. And You see it when people with blind sight report visibility, report that a stimulus is visible. So under certain conditions, as Bob mentioned, when a stimulus is presented to someone with blind sight, they'll report visibility. When and only when that happens, you see, in addition to perceptual response, parietal cortex attentional response, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex associated with working memory. That's been known for some time. It's been replicated in some recent work. There's some work even suggesting that this change is associated with gamma band activity, though I won't go into the details of that study. It relates to some of the complications that Bob mentioned in his talk. If you just look for gamma in consciousness without looking at attention specifically, you also see evidence that gamma is associated with consciousness. This is an animation from Gaillard, and what we're looking at here is the increase in gamma activity after onset of the stimulus. And what you'll see is there's a ticker showing how long after the stimulus, and about 150 milliseconds in, you start to see these huge bursts that's increased gamma band activity. So basically, we get this correlation that says consciousness is associated with gamma, attention is associated with gamma, and it follows from this that attention is associated with consciousness. So there's this big body of kind of correlational work that I think is quite impressive. But we might want a stronger form of evidence. We might want to aim for the claim that consciousness is not just correlated with attention and its neural correlates, but it's also correlated in a stronger way in the form of necessity. That is, if you were to remove attention, consciousness should disappear as well. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that this is true. One very well-known family of findings concerns visual neglect. So for a person with neglect, these two very different houses might appear the same, and that is they're having no experience of the left-hand side. And this failure of experience is associated with damage to structures in the inferior parietal sulcus, also sometimes in the frontal eye fields, both of which are associated with the allocation of attention. So you remove attention, and you seem to remove awareness. And that seems to be support for a necessity claim. You can show this in healthy subjects. I mentioned attentional blink before. So if you present somebody with a pair of targets that they need to find in a rapid sequence, after detecting the first target, the second target is often rendered invisible. The first target seems to capture attention, making it impossible to see the second one if it appears very shortly afterwards, and this has been thought of as an attentional a form of blindness brought on by inattention. So there are certain models of how backwards masking works that appeal to attention. So it's really puzzling, if you think about it for a minute, that masking should work at all. Why is it that a stimulus needs to be present for a certain duration without being followed by something in the same area of the visual field in order to be experienced? Why should a temporal duration matter? We know that masked stimuli are getting into the nervous system, so why do they need to stick around for a certain period of time? And one answer is that duration is associated with the time that's needed for attention to kick in and modulate that stimulus. If a mask comes too soon, attention can't do the modulation. And one way to show this is to demonstrate that masking works even if the mask doesn't cover the region that was occupied by the original stimulus. So if you present a stimulus quickly followed by another stimulus that's simply surrounding that original stimulus, the first stimulus will be rendered invisible. And this has been interpreted as an attentional phenomenon. Basically, attention is drawn to the periphery, and even though there might be a trace image of the original stimulus, the inability to modulate it through attention renders it invisible. The more direct demonstrations show that if you give somebody a task that consumes their attention, they can be rendered blind. So Mack and Rock in their famous inattentional blindness studies did this with a crosshair task. You basically have to decide which of these two lines is longer. When this is being done, Mack and Rock briefly presented a surprise stimulus, an unexpected stimulus, like a geometrical shape, followed by a mask, and asked participants, did you see anything other than the crosshairs? And many say no. This can be shown in a sustained case. So many of you will have seen this slide from Steve Most. And basically the idea is if you count how many times the white balls make contact with the side of the screen, I'm going to do that. How many of you have seen this display? Okay, not all of you. So we'll actually try and run it. So count how many times the white polygons touch the side of the screen. Ready? How many times? 6, 4? Anyone more than 10? We have some precocious counters in the center. How many of you did not see the red cross? Raise your hand if you did not see a red cross. Okay, so a fair number of you. I'm going to play it again, and what you're going to see is that there's a red cross that goes along the center of the screen, and it's there for 5 seconds. So it's present there for 5 seconds. It's a different color than the rest of the objects. It's moving on a different trajectory. It's a different shape. It's a different level of luminance, yet it's not seen because attention is consumed by the counting task. So this seems like inattentional blindness can occur even for a stimulus that's present for a long period of time, which counts against the view that we're simply experiencing these rapidly presented stimuli and forgetting them. It doesn't look like it's a particularly forgettable stimulus. So removal of attention seems to eliminate awareness. Here's a more controversial case, but some people have claimed that this phenomenon, which is called motion-induced blindness, also involves removal of attention. So I'm going to start this animation, and what I want you to do is simply stare at that green flashing light in the center, and what you're going to experience is the disappearance of those yellow dots. The dots will spontaneously disappear. Are they disappearing? So raise your hand if the dots are disappearing for you. Okay, so it's working. It's been theorized by people like Bona and others that the grid in the background is capturing our attention, making it very difficult to allocate attention to any one of those yellow dots. If you focus on a yellow dot, it will not disappear. So attend to a yellow dot, it remains fixed, but if you just attend to the center, the blue seems to capture attention, making those dots disappear. Removal of attention seems to remove consciousness, but one can also argue for sufficiency. And one would do that by showing that when attention is present, consciousness seems to be present too. So for instance, when doing their inattentional blindness studies, Mack and Rock found that certain stimuli were always consciously perceived. And the stimuli that had this characteristic were ones that are known to capture our attention. So if you present a very attentionally striking word, an emotionally charged word, if you present a smiling face, or if you present the participant's own name, it's always consciously experienced. So it's a visual analog of the cocktail party effect. You can't not see your own name. It's like if you ever walk down the street and see a cafe or a bar that has your name in it, it just immediately grabs your attention, and it comes into awareness. So awareness seems to occur when attention is captured. So how many of you saw the black sheep? Okay. How many of you are confident you saw each and every white sheep? Probably not. Maybe some of you did. This is maybe becomes a philosophical debate. But the black sheep captured our attention because it was a case of pop-out. It contrasted with the surround, and as a result, you consciously experienced it. If one of those white sheep had missing legs or something, you might not have noticed that. I won't tell you if that's true. There's a well-known phenomenon, binocular rivalry, that you all know about. When you're presented with two different stimuli, one in each eye, you experience one or the other, not both. It has been shown in numerous ways that if you bring attention into one hemifield, into one eye, you can determine which of the two stimuli are consciously perceived. So shifting attention shifts the reported percept in binocular rivalry, again suggesting that attention is sufficient for consciousness. So we have lots and lots of evidence of very different kinds suggesting that attention correlates with consciousness, it's necessary for consciousness, it's sufficient for consciousness, but there has been some resistance. So in the last 10 years, there has been really a veritable cottage industry of researchers trying to find dissociations between consciousness and attention. And a lot of this work is extremely impressive and illuminating. I think the equation of consciousness and attention can withstand these critiques, but seeing how and why is instructive. So what I want to do now is give you a little tour of research that dissociates or claims to dissociate consciousness and attention, and will culminate with some of Bob Kentridge's really excellent work on this question. But let's begin with necessity. So if you doubt that attention is necessary for consciousness, you want to hang out in this quadrant of our logical space. That is, you want to show that there are cases where you remove attention but consciousness remains. And various people have tried to do this. I'll just mention one study, since it's the sufficiency claim that's the focus of our session. But consider this study by Reddy and colleagues. People are presented with an attentionally demanding task. So in this case, you just need to find find the L in a sea of T's. And as you can see by doing it yourself, it's possible to do, but it consumes your attention. And while this is going on, Reddy and collaborators very briefly flashed a stimulus, in this case the face of a celebrity, followed by a mask. And they asked participants afterwards if they saw the face and whom it was. And it turns out people are very, very good at this. And Reddy concludes that this might be a case of perception in the absence of attention. Attention has been conscious perception in the absence of attention. Attention is consumed by the central task, but people still have no difficulty reporting the face. That suggests they're consciously perceiving it without attention. What should we say about this? Well, the first thing to say is that in all the published reports on this, the authors have described this not as the absence of attention, but the near absence of attention. And the reason for that is referees simply won't let them get away with calling this a case of no attention. The reason for that is participants in these experiments are instructed that there will be a briefly flashed stimulus in the periphery. They know that they're supposed to look for this. In other words, the task demands require monitoring for a stimulus other than that very demanding task in the center. Mack and Rock already discovered a dozen or more years ago that if you give subjects instructions to monitor the screen for another stimulus, inattentional blindness disappears. It only works with a surprise stimulus. And the reason for this is we can allocate attention in a diffuse way. So even if you're engaged in a focal task, if you know that you need to monitor the scene for some change, you can do that, and you can do that quite effectively. But another thing is that the stimuli in these cases pop out. So why did this work and Mack and Rock's study didn't work? That is, why are people conscious of the Tom Cruise face when they weren't conscious in the inattentional blindness studies? And the answer is Tom Cruise is a face, which is a very important stimulus. It's a smile, which is a very important stimulus. It's a celebrity, which is a very important stimulus. In other words, it's the kind of thing that pops out. And in fact, when Reddy and all did this with animals, they had the same effect. People tended to see the animals presented in the periphery, but when they did it with geometrical shapes and colors, the effect went away. That is, people were inattentionally blind for those stimuli. So it suggests that if you have a stimulus that captures attention, of course the dual task phenomenon won't work in generating inattentional blindness. So that's at least an illustration of a case that tries to get a dissociation with respect to necessity, and I think it's not in the end convincing, as interesting as the results may be. But I want to really spend the last bit of time focusing on the main theme for our session, which are cases of attention without consciousness. So if you doubt the sufficiency of attention for consciousness, you want to hang out here. You want to show that you can have a case where nobody is conscious, where your participants are not conscious, but nevertheless there's some evidence that they're attending. And no one has been a better and more inventive champion of this research program than Bob Kentridge, so it's a very special pleasure to be sharing the podium with him today. And what I'll try and do is now basically refresh your memory on some experiments he just told us about and explain why I think in the end of the day they don't establish what they purport to, though they may establish things that are interesting. So first, recall the experiment with GY, the famous blind sight patient. So GY is presented with a stimulus that includes a fixation point and a cue. The cue is an arrow pointing in one quadrant of the visual field, including quadrants that are blind for GY because of the damage in his striate cortex. And what Bob reported is that if the cue is valid, that is, if the cue points to the correct location of a briefly flashed stimulus, GY's accuracy improves even if that stimulus is in the blind field. So it looks like the cue is causing attention within the blind field. In other words, it's causing attention without consciousness. So a very, very striking result. And I think the main thing to say about this is this could be an orienting response rather than an attending response. And what I mean by this, I'll say a little bit more about it in a second, but just to get you going on this idea, it could be roughly that GY shifts his gaze or something like that to that quadrant rather than shifting his attention. After all, if his gaze shifted, that is, if he was looking there, or even if he formed a motor plan to shift his gaze to that location, and then a stimulus is presented there, the likelihood of successful detection and the speed of successful detection will both increase. Now, why think there's any orienting in GY? Well, we know that antecedently. Not only do we know that antecedently, blind sight was discovered because of intact orienting. Blind sight was discovered because a monkey with a sectioned primary visual cortex was tracking a lab assistant by gaze around the lab. So we know that looking is very much intact in blind sight. We even know that grasping is intact in blind sight. In fact, if you look at the tasks where they really perform at ceiling quite consistently, the ones that seem to involve some sort of motor action towards the stimulus are the best. Those are the ones where the visual ability remains most intact. So we have reason to think that orienting is present in blind sight. Given that we know that already, why not explain these results that way? Well, you might be thinking orienting just is attending, but I want to try and very briefly convince you that orienting and attending are actually separate and dissociable processes that may tend to go together but need not. First of all, there's some evidence that orienting is quite an ancient response. So you see it in insects, you see it in cephalopods, you see them shifting basically their sensory apparatus in a way that's stimulus irrelevant, even when they don't show clear evidence of attention. There is a very distinctive function of orienting with respect to attending, or in comparison to attending. Orienting basically determines what gets in. Now, by my definition of attention is an internal change that affects what flows forward once it's gotten in. So you can think of orienting as sort of part of the input process, and then attending as part of information flow for inputs that have already been encoded. So they're serving different functions. They have very distinctive roles. So there's a lot of evidence suggesting that orienting is related to actual execution of movements. There's some old research, old meaning like 15 years old, linking different parts of the parietal cortex to forming intentions to move or to saccade as opposed to attention. So intention and attention are dissociable biologically, and I think orienting involves intention rather than attention. They're behaviorally dissociable, so Posner and others have shown for decades now that you can say look in one direction while attending in another. And they're anatomically separable. So if you look at the parietal cortex, more superior areas seem to be associated with intending or orienting, more posterior areas associated with attending. And if you look cell by cell and the little arrow pointing to where the cue will occur, that can increase this effect. So the data basically look like this, and if you just pay attention down there, that's the main result. The main result shows that if an arrow is pointed to where that circle is going to appear, the priming effect is increased. And this looks like a case, again, of attention without consciousness. Why? You're attending to the circle, but you have no conscious experience of it. But again, I think it could be orienting. Now, why think this is orienting? The one reason for that is the leading theory of how meta-contrast masking works is an attention-based theory. It says the circle succeeds in masking, the ring succeeds in masking the circle because it pulls attention away from the circle to the periphery. If you take that leading model seriously, then this kind of meta-contrast masking is an inattention task. That's precisely what the phenomenon is. So we have independent reason to think there's no attention here, and it might just be that the cue leads people to allocate more gaze or more intention to gaze to the region where this prime is going to appear. Similar things can be said about a colorful study that was done by Jiang and colleagues, and basically what they did is they used a phenomenon called interocular suppression. The participants are presented with two stimuli, one in each eye. One stimulus is this very colorful stimulus you see at the bottom, and the other is a less colorful stimulus that includes a picture of a nude person, male or female person, presented without clothes. Okay, because the stimulus that's very colorful is brighter and higher in contrast than the nude, nobody experiences the nude. So they have this really kind of lame lab experience where they volunteer for the study to see nudes, and all they see are these bright colors, okay? So what ends up going on, though, is the nude manages to, the authors say, attract attention. even though it's invisible, it's causing a shift in attention. And they show this by a stimulus detection task. After staring at this nude, this invisible nude for a while, you're presented with a stimulus that's either where the nude was located or in a different location. And if the stimulus is in the same location as the nude, people are faster and better at detecting it. Again, this looks like attention is being allocated without awareness. You're attending to the nude, even though you don't see it. But I want to suggest again that this is just orientation. And the reason why I think this is orientation and not attention is there's a lot of evidence that the basic biological and behavioral signature properties of attention are not present in this case. In cases of interocular suppression, we know that there is no gain in the ventral system, suggesting an increase in metabolic activity associated with the stimulus, and that's a well-known neural profile of attending. You see no increase in gamma band activity, and as we saw already, gamma is associated with attention, and you can show that gamma is not present for the stimulus that's not experienced in interocular suppression. So the signature property at the neural level is not present. And of course, behaviorally, there's no availability. People don't report the nude. So if consciousness is availability, this looks like a stimulus that's radically unavailable, suggesting that, again, there is no attention available in this case. To put it simply, the bright, colorful stimulus consumes all of our attention, and as a result, we end up not experiencing the nude, but we can still orient to it or form an intention to shift our gaze there, and that could explain performance. And I want to end by a few remarks on Bob's newest work. And I want to preface these remarks with the following words of praise. In my mind, and I have a hobby of surveying this research, this is to date the best work that's been done trying to establish a dissociation between consciousness and attention. I think this new body of research is absolutely gorgeous. I think it's illuminating, very impressive, and I'm not sure what I'm going to say about it now is going to be convincing to Bob or to anyone here, but I'll tell you what I think. So just to remind you of how this works, Bob is capitalizing on object-based attention, and in old classic work on this by Eagley and colleagues, you can show that if you present a cue in a pair of shapes, and then present a target that's either in the same location as the cue, those are the valid trials, or in an invalid location but in the same object, both of those cases you see better or faster cue detection than in a case where the target is presented in a totally different object. Okay, and this works with the horizontal and the vertical, same basic effect. And the genius stroke that you see in Bob's study is he basically took this paradigm of object-based attention and he made it invisible. He made these stimuli invisible and got the same effect. So the basic result is if you present a stimulus in a location that belonged to an object that was invisible, even if it wasn't the cued location in that object, its detection is facilitated as compared to if you present it in a different object. This shows that it's not merely orientation going on in these dissociation studies, or at least in this one. If it were orientation, what we should expect is facilitation for the location of the cue, but not for other locations in the same object. But this shows that there's a spread of information processing to the entire object, so it's not mere orientation to a specific location in space. Does this establish once and for all that there can be attention in the absence of consciousness? I don't think so, but these replies are preliminary. In fact, I learned about this research only last night, and it's not Bob's fault. He told me about it weeks ago, but I managed to not listen. One possibility is there could be a kind of orienting that's object-specific. If you think about how the dorsal stream works, and you think about all this work on visually guided action, a lot of that action takes into account the specific geometry of the objects that are presented to us. And it does so in a way that seems to be somewhat independent of awareness. So if we have a large body of research that we can orient our bodies, we can orient our hands, we can maybe orient our saccades in a way that it's sensitive to object boundaries through the dorsal stream, which is not associated with consciousness, then that might be some evidence that this could be driven by an orienting process, but we need to expand our notion of orienting to include this new idea of object-based orienting, an idea that doesn't yet exist in the literature but is worthy of exploration. Another possibility is that attention is involved, but attention involves multiple stages of processing, and not every stage is present. So think about attention as involving at least these two stages. There might be a selection of a stimulus first, that's stage one, and then that stimulus might be rendered available to the perceiver. Now, maybe these studies show that you can get the first thing, selection, that aspect of attention that involves selection present in the absence of consciousness, but it doesn't show that the second part of attention, availability, which is the one I emphasized, can be there in the absence of consciousness. So it's a partial victory for both of us. But I think quite independently of this, there's reason for doubting that attention is involved in these cases, or to put it more carefully, there's at least reason for doubting that full attention, that every process associated with attention is involved. Most crucially, if attention characteristically involves availability to working memory, for me that's the correlate of attention, it's very clear in these studies that attention has not been achieved, because these participants in the study are not able to report on the rectangles that are presented to them. So there's no availability. But another point, and this will be my final point and I'll stop, is there's a large body of research on what's called object-based neglect. Some people with visual neglect are nevertheless able to track the contours of objects, and their neglect focuses not on the left half of visual space, but on the left half of visually perceived objects. So in a classic demonstration of this, Tipper and Berman gave people with neglect a kind of barbell like this, and they presumed and confirmed that people with neglect, when presented with this barbell, neglect the left-hand side. They basically just see the red circle in the center. But in their clever move, what they did is they then rotated the barbell. And now they asked people with neglect what they see. If neglect went always to the left side of space, they should now neglect the red circle. But in fact, they continue to neglect the blue circle, which means they've assigned this object a shape. It has an object file in the brain, and they're neglecting a side of the object, not a side of visual space. But this suggests that there can be something like object selection independent of attention. After all, people with neglect are people with major attention deficits. So if attention can be damaged while people can still track the shape of an object and monitor that object as it moves to different locations in space, that's evidence for a selection process that can operate independently of attention. So I think the preponderance of evidence suggests that when you remove attention, you remove consciousness. When you introduce attention, you introduce consciousness. And the alleged associations, while illuminating about the basic processes by which information is made available in the mind-brain, don't establish any firm counterexamples to the equation. So I think that basic circuit where you see perception, attention, and working memory continues to be our best candidate for the systems level neural correlate of consciousness, which is to say consciousness might just be attention. And I'll leave it at that and make our little circuit head smile. Thanks.